Section 49 of A Popular History of France, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kathy Barratt. A Popular History of France from the Earliest Times, Volume 4, by François Guizot, translated by Robert Black. Chapter 34, Henry III and the Religious Wars, 1574 to 1589, Part 4. And what was Henry III, King of France, doing whilst two great parties and two great men were thus carrying on around his throne and in his name so passionate a war, on the one side to maintain the despotic unity of Catholic Christianism, and on the other to win religious liberty for Christian Protestantism? We will borrow here the words of the most enlightened and most impartial historian of the 16th century, M. de Thou. If we acted upon our own personal impressions alone, there would be danger of appearing too severe towards a king whom we profoundly despise. After having stayed some time in Bourbonness, Henry III went to Lyons in order to be within hail of his two favourites, Joyeuse and Epernon, who were each on the march with an army. Whilst he was at Lyons, as unconcerned as if all the realm were enjoying perfect peace, he took to collecting those little dogs which are thought so much of in that town. Everybody was greatly surprised to see a king of France, in the midst of so terrible a war and in extreme want of money, expending upon such pleasures all the time he had at disposal and all the sums he could scrape together. How lavish soever this prince may have been, yet, if comparison be made between the expenditure upon the royal household and that incurred at Lyons for dogs, the latter will be found infinitely higher than the former. Without counting expenses for hunting dogs and birds, which always come to a considerable sum in the households of kings, it cost him every year more than 100,000 gold crowns for little Lyonnese dogs, and he maintained at his court, with large salaries, a multitude of men and women who had nothing to do but to feed them. He also spent large sums in monkeys, parrots, and other creatures from foreign countries, of which he always kept a great number. Sometimes he got tired of them, and gave them all away, then his passion for such creatures returned, and they had to be found for him at no matter what cost. Since I am upon the subject of this prince's attachment to matters anything but worthy of the kingly majesty, I will say a word about his passion for those miniatures which were to be found in manuscript prayer books, and which, before the practice of printing, were done by the most skilful painters. Henry III seemed to buy such works, intended for princes and laid by in cabinets of curiosities, only to spoil them. As soon as he had them, he cut them out, and then pasted them upon the walls of his chapels, as children do. An incomprehensible character of mind; in certain things capable of upholding his rank, in some rising above his position, in others sinking below childishness." A mind and character incomprehensible indeed, if corruption, lassitude, listlessness, and fear would not explain the existence of everything that is abnormal and pitiable about human nature in a feeble, cold, and selfish creature, excited, and at the same time worn out by the business and the pleasures of kingship, which Henry III could neither do without nor bear the burden of. His perplexity was extreme in his relations with the other two Henrys, who gave, like himself, their name to this war, which was called by contemporaries the War of the Three Henrys. The successes of Henry de Guise and of Henry de Bourbon were almost equally disagreeable to Henry de Valois. It is probable that if he could have chosen, he would have preferred those of Henry de Bourbon. If they caused him jealousy, they did not raise in him the same distrust. He knew the King of Navarre's loyalty, and did not suspect him of aiming to become, whilst he himself was living, King of France. Besides, he considered the Protestants less powerful and less formidable than the Leaguers. Henry de Guise, on the contrary, was evidently, in his eyes, an ambitious conspirator, determined to push his own fortunes on to the very crown of France, if the chances were favourable to him, and not only armed with all the power of Catholicism, but urged forward by the passions of the League, perhaps further, and certainly more quickly, than his own intentions travelled. Since 1584, the Leaguers had, at Paris, acquired strong organization amongst the populace. The city had been partitioned out into 5 districts, under 5 heads, who shortly afterwards added to themselves 11 others, in order that in the secret council of the association each amongst the 16 quarters of Paris might have its representative and director. Thence the famous Committee of 16, which played so great and so formidable a part in the history of that period. It was religious fanaticism and democratic fanaticism closely united, and in a position to impose their wills upon their most eminent leaders, upon the Duke of Guise himself. In vain did Henry III. Attempt to resume some sort of authority in Paris. His government, his public and private life, and his person were daily attacked, insulted, and menaced from the elevation of the pulpit and in the public thoroughfares by qualified preachers or mob orators. On the 16th of December, 1587, the Sorbonne voted, after a deliberation which it was said was to be kept secret, "that the government might be taken away from princes who were found not what they ought to be, just as the administration of a property from a guardian open to suspicion." On the 30th of December, the king summoned to the Louvre his court of Parliament and the faculty of theology. "I know of your precious resolution of the 16th of this month," said he to the Sorbonne. "I have been requested to take no notice of it, seeing that it was passed after dinner. I have no mind to avenge myself for these outrages as I might, and as Pope Sixtus V. did when he sent to the galleys certain Cordeliers for having dared to slander him in their sermons. There is not one of you who has not deserved as much and more. But it is my good pleasure to forget all, and to pardon you, on condition of its not occurring again. If it should, I beg my court of Parliament here present to exact exemplary justice, and such as the seditious, like you, may take warning by, so as to mind their own business." At their exit after this address, the Parliament and the Sorbonne, being quite sure that the king would not carry the matter further, withdrew smiling, and saying, "He certainly has spirit, but not enough of it," or habet quidem animum, sed non satis animi. The Duke of Guise's sister, the Duchess of Montpensier, took to getting up and spreading about all sorts of pamphlets against the king and his government. "The king commanded her to quit his city of Paris. She did nothing of the kind, and 3 days after she was even brazen enough to say that she carried at her waist the scissors which would give a third crown to brother Henry de Valois." At the close of 1587, the Duke of Guise made a trip to Rome, "with a suite of 5, and he only remained 3 days, so disguised that he was not recognized there, and discovered himself to nobody but Cardinal Pelleve, with whom he was in communication day and night." 18 months previously, the cardinal had given a very favorable reception to a case drawn up by an advocate in the Parliament of Paris, named David, who maintained that, "although the line of the Capet had succeeded to the temporal administration of the kingdom of Charlemagne, it had not succeeded to the apostolic benediction, which appertained to none but the posterity of the said Charlemagne, and that the line of Capet being some of them possessed by a spirit of giddiness and stupidity, and others heretic and excommunicated, the time had come for restoring the crown to the true heirs." That is to say, to the house of Lorraine, which claimed to be issue of Charlemagne. This case was passed on, it is said, from Rome to Philip II., King of Spain, and M. de Saint Goard, ambassador of France at Madrid, sent Henry III. A copy of it. Whatever may have been the truth about this trip to Rome on the part of the Duke of Guise, and its influence upon what followed, the chiefs of the Leaguers resolved to deal a great blow. The Lorraine princes and their intimate associates met at Nancy in January 1588, and decided that a petition should be presented to the king, that he should be called upon to join himself more openly and in good earnest to the League, and to remove from offices of consequence all the persons that should be pointed out to him; that the Holy Inquisition should be established, at any rate in the good towns; that important places should be put into the hands of specified chiefs, who should have the power of constructing fortifications there; that heretics should be taxed a third, or at the least a fourth, of their property as long as the war lasted; and lastly, that the life should be spared of no enemy taken prisoner, unless upon his swearing and finding good surety to live as a Catholic, and upon paying in ready money the worth of his property if it had not already been sold. These monstrous proposals, drawn up in 11 articles, were immediately carried to the king. He did not reject them, but he demanded and took time to discuss them with the authors. The negotiation was prolonged. The ferment in Paris was redoubled. The king, it was said, meant to withdraw; his person must be secured. The Committee of 16 took measures to that end; one of its members got into his hands the keys of the gate of St. Denis. From Soissons, where he was staying, the Duke of Guise sent to Paris the Count of Brissac, with 4 other captains of the League, to hold themselves in readiness for any event, and he ordered his brother, the Duke of Aumale, to stoutly maintain his garrisons in the places of Picardy, which the king, it was said, meant to take from him. "If the king leaves Paris," the duke wrote to Bernard de Mendoza, Philip II.'s ambassador in France, "I will make him think about returning thither before he has gone a day's march towards the Picards." Philip II. made Guise an offer of 300,000 crowns, 6,000 lanzknechts, and 1,200 lances, as soon as he should have broken with Henry III. "The abscess will soon burst," wrote the ambassador to the king his master. On the 8th of May, 1588, at 11 p.m., the Duke of Guise set out from Soissons, after having commended himself to the prayers of the convents in the town. He arrived the next morning before Paris, which he entered about midday by the gate of Saint Martin. The Leaguers had been expecting him for several days. Though he had covered his head with his cloak, he was readily recognized and eagerly cheered. The burgesses left their houses and the tradesmen their shops to see him and follow him, shouting, "Hurrah for Guise! Hurrah for the pillar of the church!" The crowd increased at every step. He arrived in front of the palace of Catherine de' Medici, who had not expected him, and grew pale at sight of him. "My dear cousin," said she to him, "I am very glad to see you, but I should have been better pleased at another time." "Madame, I am come to clear myself from all the calumnies of my enemies; do me the honor to conduct me to the king yourself." Catherine lost no time in giving the king warning by one of her secretaries. On receipt of this notice, Henry III., who had at first been stolid and silent, rose abruptly from his chair. "Tell my lady mother that, as she wishes to present the Duke of Guise to me, I will receive him in the chamber of the queen my wife." The envoy departed. The king, turning to one of his officers, Colonel Alfonso Corso, said to him, "Monsieur de Guise has just arrived at Paris, contrary to my orders. What would you do in my place?" "Sir, do you hold the Duke of Guise for friend or enemy?" The king, without speaking, replied by a significant gesture. "If it please your Majesty to give me the order, I will this very day lay the duke's head at your feet." The 3 councillors who happened to be there cried out. The king held his peace. During this conversation at the Louvre, the Duke of Guise was advancing along the streets, dressed in a doublet of white damask, a cloak of black cloth, and boots of buffalo hide. He walked on foot, bareheaded, at the side of the queen mother in a sedan chair. He was tall, with fair, clustering hair and piercing eyes, and his scar added to his martial air. The mob pressed upon his steps. Flowers were thrown to him from the windows. Some, adoring him as a saint, touched him with chaplets which they afterwards kissed. A young girl darted towards him, and, removing her mask, kissed him, saying, "Brave prince, since you are here, we are all saved." Guise, with a dignified air, "saluted and delighted everybody," says a witness, "with eye and gesture and speech." "By his side," said Madame de Retz, "the other princes are commoners." "The Huguenots," said another, "become Leaguers at the very sight of him." On arriving at the Louvre, he traversed the court between 2 rows of soldiers, the archers on duty in the hall, and the 45 gentlemen of the king's chamber at the top of the staircase. "What brings you hither?" said the king, with difficulty restraining his anger. "I entreat your Majesty to believe in my fidelity, and not allow yourself to go by the reports of my enemies." "Did I not command you not to come at this season so full of suspicions, but to wait yet a while?" "Sir, I was not given to understand that my coming would be disagreeable to you." Catherine drew near, and in a low tone told her son of the demonstrations of which the duke had been the object on his way. Guise was received in the chamber of the queen, Louise de Vaudemont, who was confined to her bed by indisposition. He chatted with her a moment, and, saluting the king, retired without being attended by any one of the officers of the court. Henry III. confined himself to telling him that results should speak for the sincerity of his words. Guise returned to his house in the Faubourg Saint Antoine, still accompanied by an eager and noisy crowd, but somewhat disquieted at heart both by the king's angry reception and the people's enthusiastic welcome. Brave as he was more ambitious in conception than bold in execution, and he had not made up his mind to do all that was necessary to attain the end he was pursuing. The Committee of 16, his confidants, and all the staff of the League met at his house during the evening and night between the 9th and 10th of May, preparing for the morrow's action without well knowing what it was to be, proposing various plans, collecting arms, and giving instructions to their agents amongst the populace. An agitation of the same sort prevailed at the Louvre. The king, too, was deliberating with his advisers as to what he should do on the morrow. Guise would undoubtedly present himself at his morning levee. Should he at once rid himself of him by the poniards of the 45 bravos which the Duke of Epernon had enrolled in Gascony for his service? Or would it be best to summon to Paris some troops, French and Swiss, to crush the Parisian rebels and the adventurers that had hurried up from all parts to their aid? But on the 10th of May, Guise went to the Louvre with 400 gentlemen well armed with breastplates and weapons under their cloaks. The king did nothing. No more did Guise. The two had a long conversation in the queen mother's garden, but it led to no result. On the 11th of May, in the evening, the provost of tradesmen, Hector de Perreuse, assembled the town council and those of the district colonels on whom he had reliance to receive the king's orders. Orders came to muster the burgher companies of certain districts and send them to occupy certain positions that had been determined upon. They mustered slowly and incompletely, and some not at all, and scarcely had they arrived when several left the posts which had been assigned to them. The king, being informed of this sluggishness, sent for the regiment of the French Guards and for 4,000 Swiss cantoned in the outskirts of Paris; and he himself mounted his horse on the 12th of May, in the morning, to go and receive them at the gate of Saint Honore. These troops "filed along, without fife or drum, towards the cemetery of the Innocents." The populace regarded them as they passed with a feeling of angry curiosity and uneasy amazement. When all the corps had arrived at the appointed spot, "they put themselves in motion towards different points, now making a great noise with their drums and fifes, which marvellously astonished the inhabitants of the quarter." Noise provokes noise. "Incontinently," says L'Estoile, "everybody seizes his arms, goes out on guard in the streets and cantons; in less than no time chains are stretched across and barricades made at the corners of the streets. The mechanic leaves his tools, the tradesman his business, the university their books, the attorneys their bags, the advocates their bands, the presidents and councillors themselves take halberds in hand. Nothing is heard but shouts, murmurs, and the seditious speeches that heat and alarm a people." The tocsin sounded everywhere. Barricades sprang up in the twinkling of an eye. They were made within 30 paces of the Louvre. The royal troops were hemmed in where they stood, and deprived of the possibility of moving. The Swiss, being attacked, lost 50 men and surrendered, holding up their chaplets and exclaiming that they were good Catholics. It was thought sufficient to disarm the French guards. The king, remaining stationary at the Louvre, sent his marshals to parley with the people massed in the thoroughfares. The queen mother had herself carried over the barricades in order to go to Guise's house and attempt some negotiation with him. He received her coldly, demanding that the king should appoint him lieutenant general of the kingdom, declare the Huguenot princes incapacitated from succeeding to the throne, and assemble the States General. At the approach of evening, Guise determined to go himself and assume the conqueror's air by putting a stop to the insurrection. He issued from his house on horseback, unarmed, with a white wand in his hand. He rode through the different districts, exhorting the inhabitants to keep up their barricades, whilst remaining on the defensive and leaving him to complete their work. He was greeted on all sides with shouts of "Hurrah for Guise!" "You wrong me, my friends," said he; "you should shout, 'Hurrah for the king!'" He had the French guards and the Swiss set at liberty; and they defiled before him, arms lowered and bareheaded, as before their preserver. Next morning, May 13, he wrote to d'Entragues, governor of Orleans, "Notify our friends to come to us in the greatest haste possible, with horses and arms, but without baggage, which they will easily be able to do, for I believe that the roads are open hence to you. I have defeated the Swiss, and cut in pieces a part of the king's guards, and I hold the Louvre invested so closely that I will render good account of whatsoever there is in it. This is so great a victory that it will be remembered for ever." That same day the provost of tradesmen and the royalist sheriffs repaired to the Louvre, and told the king that without great and immediate concessions they could not answer for anything. The Louvre was not in a condition of defence. There were no troops to be depended upon for resistance, no provisions, no munitions. The investment was growing closer and closer every hour, and the assault might commence at any instant. Henry III. sent his mother once more to the Duke of Guise, and himself went out about 4 o'clock, dressed in a country suit and scantily attended, as if for a walk in the Tuileries. Catherine found the duke as inflexible as he had been the day before. He peremptorily insisted upon all the conditions he had laid down already: the lieutenant generalship of the kingdom for himself, the unity of the Catholic faith, forfeiture on the part of the King of Navarre and every other Huguenot prince as heir to the throne, perpetual banishment of the king's favorites, and convocation of the states general. "The king," he said, "purposes to destroy all the grandees of the kingdom and to harry all those who oppose his wishes and the elevation of his minions. It is my duty and my interest to take all the measures necessary for my own preservation and that of the people." Catherine yielded on nearly every point, at the same time, however, continually resuming and prolonging the discussion. One of the duke's most trusty confidants, Francis de Mainville, entered and whispered in his ear. "Madame," cried the duke, "whilst your Majesty has been amusing me here, the king is off from Paris to harry me and destroy me." Henry III., indeed, had taken horse at the Tuileries, and, attended by his principal councillors, unbooted and cloakless, had issued from the new gate, and set out on the road to Saint Cloud. Equipping him in haste, his squire, Duhalde, had put his spur on wrong, and would have it set right, but, "That will do," said the king; "I am not going to see my mistress; I have a longer journey to make." It is said that the corps on guard at the Nesle gate fired from a distance a salute of arquebus after the fugitive king, and that a crowd assembled on the other bank of the river shouted insults after him. At the height of Chaillot, Henry pulled up, and turning round towards Paris, "Ungrateful city," he cried, "I have loved thee more than my own wife. I will not enter thy walls again but by the breach." End of section 49. Section 50 of A Popular History of France, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kathy Barratt. A Popular History of France from the Earliest Times, Volume 4, by François Guizot. Translated by Robert Black. Chapter 34. Henry III. And the Religious Wars, 1574 to 1589, Part 5. It is said that, on hearing of the Duke of Guise's sudden arrival at Paris, Pope Sixtus V. exclaimed, "Ah, what rashness, to thus go and put himself in the hands of a prince he has so outraged!" And some days afterwards, on the news that the king had received the Duke of Guise and nothing had come of it, "Ah, dastard prince, poor creature of a prince, to have let such a chance escape him of getting rid of a man who seems born to be his destruction." When the king was gone, Guise acted the master in Paris. He ordered the immediate delivery into his hands of the Bastille, the Arsenal, and the castle of Vincennes. Ornano, governor of the Bastille, sent an offer to the king, who had arrived at Chartres, to defend it to the last extremity. "I will not expose to so certain a peril a brave man who may be necessary to me elsewhere," replied the king. Guise caused to be elected at Paris a new town council and a new provost of tradesmen, all taken from amongst the most ardent Leaguers. He at the same time exerted himself to restore order. He allowed all royalists who wished to depart to withdraw to Chartres. He went in person and pressed the premier president of Parliament, Achille de Harlay, to resume the course of justice. "It is great pity, sir," said Harlay, "when the servant drives out the master. This assembly is founded (seated) on the fleur de lis. Being established by the king, it can act only for his service. We will all lose our lives to a man rather than give way a whit to the contrary." "I have been in many battles," said Guise as he went out, "in assaults and encounters the most dangerous in the world, and I have never been so overcome as at my reception by this personage." At the same time that he was trying to exercise authority and restore order, unbridled violence and anarchy were making head around him. The 16 and their friends discharged from the smallest offices, civil or religious, whoever was not devoted to them. They changed all the captains and district officers of the city militia. They deposed all the incumbents, all the ecclesiastics whom they termed Huguenots and policists. The pulpits of Christians became the platforms of demagogues. The preachers Guiticestre, Boucher, Rose, John Prévost, Aubry, Piganat, Cuilly, Pelletier, and a host of others, whose names have fallen into complete obscurity, were the popular apostles, the real firebrands of the troubles of the League, says Pasquier. There was scarcely a chapel where there were not several sermons a day. "You know not your strength," they kept repeating to their auditors. "Paris knows not what she is worth. She has wealth enough to make war upon 4 kings. France is sick, and she will never recover from that sickness till she has a draught of French blood given her. If you receive Henry de Valois into your towns, make up your minds to see your preachers massacred, your sheriffs hanged, your women violated, and the gibbets garnished with your members." One of these raving orators, Claude Trahy, provincial of the Cordeliers, devoted himself to hounding on the populace of Auxerre against their bishop, James Amiot, the translator of Plutarch, whom he reproached with "having communicated with Henry III. And administered to him the Eucharist." Brother John Morissin, one of Trahy's subalterns, went about brandishing a halbert in the public place at Auxerre and shouting, "Courage, lads! Messire Amiot is a wicked man, worse than Henry de Valois. He has threatened to have our master Trahy hanged, but he will repent it." And, "at the voice of this madman, there hurried up vine dressers, boatmen, and marchands d'eau (costermongers), a whole angry mob, who were for having Amiot's throat cut and Trahy made bishop in his stead." Whilst the blind passions of fanatics and demagogues were thus let loose, the sensible and clear sighted spirits, the earnest and moderate royalists, did not all of them remain silent and motionless. After the appearance of the letters written in 1588 by the Duke of Guise to explain and justify his conduct in this crisis, a grandson of Chancellor de l'Hospital, Michael Hureau, Sieur du Fay, published a document entitled Frank and Free Discourse upon the Condition of France, one of the most judicious and most eloquent pamphlets of the 16th century, a profound criticism upon the acts of the Duke of Guise, their causes and consequences, and a true picture of the falsehoods and servitude into which an eminent man may fall when he makes himself the tool of a popular faction, in the hope of making that faction the tool of his personal ambition. But even the men who were sufficiently enlightened and sufficiently courageous to tell the League and its leader plain truths spoke only rather late in the day, and at first without giving their names. The document written by L'Hospital's grandson did not appear until 1591, after the death of Henry III. And Henry de Guise, and it remained anonymous for some time. One cannot be astonished at such timidity. Guise himself was timid before the Leaguers, and he always ended by yielding to them in essentials, after having attempted to resist them upon such and such an incidental point. His own people accused him of lacking boldness, and his sister, the Duchess of Montpensier, openly patronized the most violent preachers, whilst boasting that she wielded more influence through them than her brother by his armies. Henry III., under stress of his enemy's zeal and his own servant's weakness, Catherine de' Medici included, after having fled from Paris and taken refuge at Chartres to escape the triumph of the barricades, once more began to negotiate, that is, to capitulate with the League. He issued at Rouen, on the 19th of July, 1588, an edict in 11 articles, whereby he granted more than had been demanded, and more than he had promised in 1585 by the Treaty of Nemours. Over and above the measures contained in that treaty against the Huguenots, in respect of the present and the future, he added 4 fresh surety towns, amongst others Bourges and Orleans, to those of which the Leaguers were to remain in possession. He declared, moreover, "that no investigation should be made into any understandings, associations, and other matters into which our Catholic subjects might have entered together, inasmuch as they have given us to understand, and have informed us, that what they did was but owing to the zeal they felt for the preservation and maintenance of the Catholic religion." By thus releasing the League from all responsibility for the past, and by giving this new treaty the name of Edict of Union, Henry III. Flattered himself, it is said, that he was thus putting himself at the head of a new grand Catholic League, which would become royalist again, inasmuch as the king was granting it all it had desired. The Edict of Union was enregistered at the Parliament of Paris on the 21st of July. The States General were convoked for the 15th of October following. "On Tuesday, August 2, his Majesty," says L'Estoile, "being entertained by the Duke of Guise during his dinner, asked him for drink, and then said to him, 'To whom shall we drink?' 'To whom you please, sir,' answered the duke. 'It is for your Majesty to command.' 'Cousin,' said the king, 'drink we to our good friends the Huguenots.' 'It is well said, sir,' answered the duke. 'And to our good barricaders,' said the king, 'let us not forget them.' Whereupon the duke began to laugh a little, says L'Estoile, but a sort of laugh that did not go beyond the knot of the throat, being dissatisfied at the novel union the king was pleased to make of the Huguenots with the barricaders." What must have, to some extent, reassured the Duke of Guise was that a Te Deum was celebrated at Notre Dame for the King of Navarre's exclusion from all right to the crown, and that on the 14th of August Henry de Guise was appointed generalissimo of the royal armies. The States General met at Blois on the 16th of October, 1588. They numbered 505 deputies, 191 of the third estate, 180 of the noblesse, 134 of the clergy. The king had given orders "to conduct each deputy as they arrived to his cabinet, that he might see, hear, and know them all personally." When the 505 deputies had taken their places in the hall, the Duke of Guise went to fetch the king, who made his entry attended by the princes of the blood, and opened the session with the dignity and easy grace which all the Valois seem to have inherited from Francis I. The Duke of Guise, in a coat of white satin, was seated at the king's feet, as high steward of his household, scanning the whole assembly with his piercing glance, as if to keep watch over those who were in his service. "He seemed," says a contemporary, "by a single flash of his eye to fortify them in the hope of the advancement of his designs, his fortunes, and his greatness, and to say to them, without speaking, 'I see you.'" The king's speech was long, able, well delivered, and very much applauded, save by Guise himself and his particular friends. The firmness of tone had displeased them, and one sentence excited in them a discontent which they had found difficulty in restraining. "Certain grandees of my kingdom have formed such leagues and associations as, in every well ordered monarchy, are crimes of high treason, without the sovereign's permission. But, showing my wonted indulgence, I am quite willing to let bygones be bygones in this respect." Guise grew pale at these words. On leaving the royal session, he got his private committee to decide that the Cardinal of Guise and the Archbishop of Lyons should go to see the king, and beg him to abandon the printing of his speech, and meanwhile Guise himself sent to the printers to stop the immediate publication. Discussion took place next day in the king's cabinet, and a threat was held out to him that a portion of the deputies would quit the meeting of states. The queen mother advised her son to compromise. The king yielded, according to his custom, and gave authority for cutting out the strongest expressions, amongst others those just quoted. "The correction was accordingly made," says M. Picot, the latest and most able historian of the States General, "and Henry III. had to add this new insult to all that were rankling at the bottom of his heart since the affair of the barricades." This was, for the Duke of Guise, a first trial of his power, and great was his satisfaction at this first success. On leaving the opening session of the States General, he wrote to the Spanish ambassador Mendoza, "I handled our states so well that I made them resolve to require confirmation of the Edict of Union of July 21 preceding, as fundamental law of the state. The king refused to do so, in rather sharp terms, to the deputies who brought the representation before him, and from that it is presumed that he inclines towards a peace with the heretics. But at last he was so pressed by the states, the which were otherwise on the point of breaking up, that he promised to swear the edict and have it sworn before entering upon consideration of any matter." The next day but one, in fact on the 18th of October, at the second session of the States General, "the edict of July 21 was read and published with the greatest solemnity. The king swore to maintain it in terms calculated to dissipate all anxieties on the part of the Catholics. The deputies swore after him. The Archbishop of Bourges delivered an address on the sanctity of oaths, and those present began to think the session over, when the king rose a second time to recommend the deputies not to leave Blois before the papers were drawn up and the ordinances made. He reminded them that at the last assembly of the states the suggestions and counsels of the three estates had been so ill carried out that, instead of a reformation and an establishment of good laws, everything had been thrown into confusion. Accordingly, the king added to this suggestion a solemn oath that he would not budge from the city until he had made an edict, sacred and inviolable. The enthusiasm of the deputies was at its height. A rush took place to the church of Saint Sauveur to chant a Te Deum. All the princes were there to give thanks to God. Never were king, court, and people so joyous." The Duke of Guise wrote to the Spanish ambassador, "At length we have, in full assembly of the states, had our edict of union solemnly sworn and established as fundamental law of this realm, having surmounted all the difficulties and hindrances which the king was pleased to throw in the way. I found myself 4 or 5 times on the point of rupture, but I was verily assisted by so many good men." After, as well as before the opening of the States General, the friends of the Duke of Guise were far from having, all of them, the same confidence that he had in his position and in his success. "Stupid owl of a Lorrainer," said Sieur de Vins, commanding, on behalf of the League in Dauphiny, on reading the duke's despatches, "has he so little sense as to believe that a king whose crown he, by dissimulating, has been wanting to take away, is not dissimulating in turn to take away his life?" "As they are so thick together," said M. de Vins's sister, when she knew that the Duke of Guise was at Blois with the king, "you will hear, at the very first opportunity, that one or the other has killed his fellow." Guise himself was no stranger to this idea. "We are not without warnings from all quarters that there is a design of attempting my life," he wrote on the 21st of September, 1588; "but I have, thank God, so provided against it, both by the gathering I have made of a good number of my friends, and in having, by presents and money, secured a portion of those whose services are relied upon for the execution of it, that if once things begin I shall finish more roughly than I did at Paris." After the opening of the States General and the success he obtained thereat, Guise appeared, if not more anxious, at any rate more attentive to the warnings he received. On the 10th of December, 1588, he wrote to Commander Moreo, confidential agent from the King of Spain, to him, "You cannot imagine what alarms have been given me since your departure. I have so well provided against them that my enemies have not seen their way to attempting anything. But expenses have grown upon me to such an extent that I have great need of your prompt assistance. I have now so much credit with this assembly that I have hitherto made it dance to my tune, and I hope that as to what remains to be decreed, I shall be quite able to maintain the same authority." Some of his partisans advised him to go away for a while to Orleans, but he absolutely refused, repeating, with the Archbishop of Lyons, "He who leaves the game loses it." One evening, in a little circle of intimates, on the 21st of December, a question arose whether it would not be advisable to prevent the king's designs by striking at his person. The Cardinal of Guise begged his brother to go away, assuring him that his own presence would suffice for the direction of affairs, but, "They are in such case, my friend," said de Balafre, "that if I saw death coming in at the window, I would not consent to go out by the door to avoid it." His cousin, the Duke of Elbeuf, paid him a visit at night to urge him to withdraw himself from the plot hatched against him. "If it were necessary to lose my life in order to reap the proximate fruits of the state's good resolution," said Guise, "that is quite what I have made up my mind to. Though I had 100 lives, I would devote them all to the service of God and his church, and to the relief of the poor people for whom I feel the greatest pity." Then, touching the Duke of Elbeuf upon the shoulder, he said, "Go to bed, cousin." And taking away his hand and laying it upon his own heart, he added, "Here is the doublet of innocence." On the evening of the 22d of December, 1588, when Charlotte de Semblancay, Marchioness of Noirmoutier, to whom he was tenderly attached, pressed him to depart, or at any rate not to be present at the council next day, the only answer he made her was to hum the following ditty by Desportes, a poet of the day: My little rose, a little spell Of absence changed that heart of thine, And I, who know the change full well, Have found another place for mine. No more such fair but fickle she Shall find me her obedient, And flighty shepherdess we'll see Which of the twain will first repent. Henry III. Was scarcely less disturbed, but in quite a different way, than the Duke of Guise. For a long time past he had been thinking about getting rid of the latter, just as he had thought for a long time, 20 years before, about getting rid of Admiral de Coligny. But since the date of his escape from the popular rising on the day of the barricades, he had hoped that, thanks to the adoption of the Edict of Union and to the convocation of the States General, he would escape the yoke of the Duke of Guise. He saw every day that he had been mistaken. The League, and consequently the Duke of Guise, had more power than he with the States General. In vain had the king changed nearly all his ministers. In vain had he removed his principal favorite, the Duke of Epernon, from the government of Normandy to that of Provence. He did not obtain from the States General what he demanded, that is, the money he wanted. And the States required of him administrative reforms, sound enough at bottom, but suggested by the Duke of Guise with an interested object, and calculated to shackle the kingly authority even more than could be done by Guise himself directly. At the same time that Guise was urging on the States General in this path, he demanded to be made constable, not by the king any longer, but by the states themselves. The kingship was thus being squeezed between the haughty supremacy of the great lords, substitutes for the feudal regimen, and the first essays of that free government which is nowadays called the parliamentary regimen. Henry III. Determined with fear and trembling to disembarrass himself of his two rivals, of the Duke of Guise by assassination, and of the States General by packing them off home. He did not know how intimately the two great questions of which the 16th century was the great cradle, the question of religious liberty and that of political liberty, were connected one with the other, and would be prosecuted jointly or successively in the natural progress of Christian civilization, or through what trials kings and people would have to pass before succeeding in any effectual solution of them. End of section 50. Section 51 of A Popular History of France, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kathy Barratt. A Popular History of France from the Earliest Times, Volume 4, by François Guizot. Translated by Robert Black. Chapter 34. Henry III and the Religious Wars, 1574 to 1589, Part 6. On the 18th of December, 1588, during an entertainment given by Catherine de' Medici on the marriage of her niece, Christine de Lorraine, with Ferdinand de' Medici, Grand Duke of Tuscany, Henry III summoned to his cabinet three of his most intimate and safest confidants, Marshal d'Aumont, Nicholas d'Angennes, Lord of Rambouillet, and Sieur de Beauvais-Nangis. After having laid before them all the Duke of Guise's intrigues against him and the perils of the position in which they placed him, "What ought I to do?" he said. "Help me to save myself by some speedy means." They asked the king to give them 24 hours to answer in. Next day, the 19th, Sieur de Maintenon, brother of Rambouillet, and Alfonso Corso d'Ornano were added to the party. Only one of them was of opinion that the Duke of Guise should at once be arrested and put upon his trial. The four others were for a shorter and a surer process, that of putting the duke to death by a sudden blow. He is evidently making war upon the king, they said, and the king has a right to defend himself. Henry III, who had his mind made up, asked Crillon, commandant of the regiment of guards, "Think you that the Duke of Guise deserves death?" "Yes, sir." "Very well, then I choose you to give it to him." "I am ready to challenge him." "That is not what is wanted. As leader of the League, he is guilty of high treason." Very well, sir, then let him be tried and executed." But Crillon, nothing is less certain than his conviction in a court of law; he must be struck down unexpectedly." "Sir, I am a soldier, not an assassin." The king did not persist, but merely charged Crillon, who promised, to keep the proposal secret. At this very time Guise was requesting the king to give him a constable's grand provost and archers to form his guard in his quality of lieutenant general of the kingdom. The king deferred his reply. Catherine de' Medici supported the Lorrainer prince's request. "In 2 or 3 days it shall be settled," said Henry. He had ordered 12 poniards from an armorer's in the city. On the 21st of December he told his project to Loignac, an officer of his guards, who was less scrupulous than Crillon, and undertook to strike the blow in concert with the 45 trusty guards. At the council on the 22nd of December, the king announced his intention of passing Christmas in retreat at Notre Dame de Clery, and he warned the members of the council that next day the session would take place very early, in order to dispose of business before his departure. On the evening of the 22d, the Duke of Guise, on sitting down at table, found under his napkin a note to this effect: "The king means to kill you." Guise asked for a pen, wrote at the bottom of the note, "He dare not," and threw it under the table. Next day, December 23, Henry III, rising at 4 a.m. after a night of great agitation, admitted into his cabinet by a secret staircase the 9 guards he had chosen, handed them the poniards he had ordered, placed them at the post where they were to wait for the meeting of the council, and bade Charles d'Entragues to go and request one of the royal chaplains "to say mass, that God might give the king grace to be able to carry out an enterprise which he hoped would come to an issue within an hour, and on which the safety of France depended." Then the king retired into his closet. The members of the council arrived in succession. It is said that one of the archers on duty, when he saw the Duke of Guise mounting the staircase, trod on his foot, as if to give him warning; but if he observed it, Guise made no account of it, any more than of all the other hints he had already received. Before entering the council chamber, he stopped at a small oratory connected with the chapel, said his prayer, and, as he passed the door of the queen mother's apartments, signified his desire to pay his respects and have a few words with her. Catherine was indisposed, and could not receive him. Some vexation, it is said, appeared in Guise's face, but he said not a word. On entering the council chamber, he felt cold, asked to have some fire lighted, and gave orders to his secretary, Pericard, the only attendant admitted with him, to go and fetch the silver gilt shell he was in the habit of carrying about him, with damsons or other preserves to eat of a morning. Pericard was some time gone. Guise was in a hurry, and, "Be kind enough," he said to M. de Morfontaine, "to send word to M. de Saint Prix, first groom of the chamber to Henry III, that I beg him to let me have a few damsons or a little preserve of roses, or some trifle of the king's." 4 Brignol plums were brought him, and he ate one. His uneasiness continued. The eye close to his scar became moist. According to M. de Thou, he bled at the nose. He felt in his pocket for a handkerchief to use, but could not find one. "My people," said he, "have not given me my necessaries this morning; there is great excuse for them; they were too much hurried." At his request, Saint Prix had a handkerchief brought to him. Pericard passed his bonbon box to him, as the guards would not let him enter again. The duke took a few plums from it, threw the rest on the table, saying, "Gentlemen, who will have any?" and rose up hurriedly upon seeing the Secretary of State Revol, who came in and said to him, "Sir, the king wants you; he is in his old cabinet." As soon as he knew that the Duke of Guise had arrived, and whilst these little incidents were occurring in the council chamber, Henry III had in fact given orders to his secretary Revol to go on his behalf and summon the duke. But Nambu, usher to the council faithful to his instructions, had refused to let anybody, even the king's secretary, enter the hall. Revol, of a timid disposition, and impressed, it is said, with the sinister importance of his commission, returned to the cabinet with a very troubled air. The king, in his turn, was troubled, fearing lest his project had been discovered. "What is the matter, Revol?" said he. "What is it? How pale you are! You will spoil all. Rub your cheeks, rub your cheeks." "There is nothing wrong, sir; only M. de Nambu would not let me in without your Majesty's express command." Revol entered the council chamber and discharged his commission. The Duke of Guise pulled up his cloak as if to wrap himself well in it, took his hat, gloves, and his sweetmeat box, and went out of the room, saying, "Adieu, gentlemen," with a gravity free from any appearance of mistrust. He crossed the king's chamber contiguous to the council hall, courteously saluted, as he passed, Loignac and his comrades, whom he found drawn up, and whom, returning him a frigid obeisance, followed him as if to show him respect. On arriving at the door of the old cabinet, and just as he leaned down to raise the tapestry that covered it, Guise was struck 5 poniard blows in the chest, neck, and reins. "God ha' mercy!" he cried, and though his sword was entangled in his cloak, and he was himself pinned by the arms and legs and choked by the blood that spurted from his throat, he dragged his murderers by a supreme effort of energy to the other end of the room, where he fell down backwards and lifeless before the bed of Henry III., who, coming to the door of his room and asking "if it was done," contemplated with mingled satisfaction and terror the inanimate body of his mighty rival. "Who seemed to be merely sleeping, so little was he changed." "My God, how tall he is!" cried the king. "He looks even taller than when he was alive." "They are killing my brother!" cried the Cardinal of Guise, when he heard the noise that was being made in the next room, and he rose up to run thither. The Archbishop of Lyons, Peter d'Espignac, did the same. The Duke of Aumont held them both back, saying, "Gentlemen, we must wait for the king's orders." Orders came to arrest them both, and confine them in a small room over the council chamber. They had "eggs, bread, wine from the king's cellar, their breviaries, their nightgowns, a palliasse, and a mattress," brought to them there, and they were kept under ocular supervision for 24 hours. The Cardinal of Guise was released the next morning, but only to be put to death like his brother. The king spared the Archbishop of Lyons. "I am sole king," said Henry III. To his ministers, as he entered the council chamber. And shortly afterwards, going to see the queen mother, who was ill of the gout, "How do you feel?" he asked. "Better," she answered. "So do I," replied the king. "I feel much better. This morning I have become King of France again. The King of Paris is dead." "You have had the Duke of Guise killed?" asked Catherine. "Have you reflected well? God grant that you become not king of nothing at all. I hope the cutting is right. Now for the sewing." According to the majority of the historians, Catherine had neither been in the secret nor had anything to do with the preparations for the measure. Granted that she took no active part in it, and that she avoided even the appearance of having any previous knowledge of it. She was not fond of responsibility, and she liked better to negotiate between the different parties than to make her decisive choice between them. Prudent tendencies grow with years, and in 1588 she was 69. It is difficult, however, to believe that, being the habitual confidant of her favorite son, she was ignorant of a design long meditated, and known to many persons many days before its execution. The event once accomplished, ill as she was, and contrary to the advice of her physicians, she had herself carried to the Cardinal of Bourbon's, who was still under arrest by the king's orders, to promise him speedy release. "Ah, madame," said the cardinal, as he saw her enter, "these are some of your tricks; you are death to us all." However it may be, 13 days after the murder of the Duke of Guise, on the 5th of January, 1589, Catherine de' Medici herself died. Nor was her death, so far as affairs and the public were concerned, an event. Her ability was of the sort which is worn out by the frequent use made of it, and which, when old age comes on, leaves no long or grateful reminiscence. Time has restored Catherine de' Medici to her proper place in history. She was quickly forgotten by her contemporaries. She had good reason to say to her son as her last advice, "Now for the sewing." It was not long before Henry III. Perceived that, to be king, it was not sufficient to have murdered his rival. He survived the Duke of Guise only 7 months, and during that short period he was not really king all by himself for a single day. Never had his kingship been so embarrassed and impotent. The violent death of the Duke of Guise had exasperated much more than enfeebled the League. The feeling against his murderer was passionate and contagious. The Catholic cause had lost its great leader. It found and accepted another in his brother, the Duke of Mayenne, far inferior to his elder brother in political talent and prompt energy of character, but a brave and determined soldier, a much better man of party and action than the sceptical, undecided, and indolent Henry III. The majority of the great towns of France, Paris, Rouen, Orleans, Toulouse, Lyons, Amiens, and whole provinces declared eagerly against the royal murderer. He demanded support from the States General, who refused it, and he was obliged to dismiss them. The Parliament of Paris, dismembered on the 16th of January, 1589, by the Council of 16, became the instrument of the Leaguers. The majority of the other parliaments followed the example set by that of Paris. The Sorbonne, consulted by a petition presented in the name of all Catholics, decided that Frenchmen were released from their oath of allegiance to Henry III, and might, with a good conscience, turn their arms against him. Henry made some obscure attempts to come to an arrangement with certain chiefs of the Leaguers, but they were rejected with violence. The Duke of Mayenne, having come to Paris on the 15th of February, was solemnly received at Notre Dame, amidst shouts of "Hurrah for the Catholic princes! Hurrah for the House of Lorraine!" He was declared Lieutenant General of the Crown and State of France. He organized a council general of the League, composed of 40 members, and charged with the duty of providing for all matters of war, the finance, and the police of the realm, pending a fresh convocation of States General. To counterbalance in some degree the popular element, Mayenne introduced into it 14 personages of his own choice and a certain number of magistrates and bishops. The delegates of the United Towns were to have seats at the council whenever they happened to be at Paris. "Never," says M. Henry very truly, "could the League have supposed itself to be so near becoming a government of confederated municipalities under the Directorate of Paris." There was clearly, for Henry III, but one possible ally who had a chance of doing effectual service, and that was Henry of Navarre and the Protestants. It cost Henry III a great deal to have recourse to that party. His conscience and his pusillanimity both revolted at it equally. In spite of his moral corruption, he was a sincere Catholic, and the prospect of excommunication troubled him deeply. Catholicism, besides, was in a large majority in France. How, then, was he to treat with its foes without embroiling himself utterly with it? Meanwhile, the case was urgent. Henry was apprised by one of his confidants, Nicolas de Rambouillet, that one of the King of Navarre's confidants, Sully, who was then only Sieur de Rosny, was passing by Blois on his way to his master. He saw him and expressed to him his desire for a reconciliation with the King of Navarre, and to employ him on confidential service. The difficulty was to secure to the Protestant king and his army, then engaged in the siege of Châtellerault, a passage across the Loire. Rosny undertook Henry III's commission. He at the same time received another from Sieur de Brigueux, governor of the little town of Beaugency, who said to him, "I see well, sir, that the king is going the right way to ruin himself by timidity, irresolution, and bad advice, and that necessity will throw us into the hands of the League. For my part, I will never belong to it, and I would rather serve the King of Navarre. Tell him that I hold at Beaugency a passage over the Loire, and that if he will be pleased to send to me you or M. de Rebours, I will admit into the town him who he sends to me." Upon receiving these overtures, the King of Navarre thought a while, scratching his head. Then he said to Rosny, "Do you think that the king has good intentions towards me, and means to treat with me in good faith?" "Yes, sir, for the present, and you need have no doubt about it, for his straits constrain him thereto, having nothing to look to in his perils but your assistance." He had some dinner brought into his own cabinet for Rosny, and then made him post off at once. On arriving in the evening at Tours, whither Henry III had fallen back, Rosny was taken to him, about midnight, at the top of the castle. The king sent him off that very night. He consented to everything that the King of Navarre proposed, promised him a town on the Loire, and said he was ready to make with him, not a downright peace just at first, but "a good long truce, which in their two hearts would at once be an eternal peace and a sincere reconciliation." When Rosny got back to Châtellerault, "there was nothing but rejoicing. Everybody ran to meet him. He was called God Rosny," and one of his friends said to the rest, "Do you see yon man? By God, we shall all worship him, and he alone will restore France. I said so 6 years ago, and Villandry was of my opinion." End of section 51. Section 52 of A Popular History of France, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kathy Barratt. A Popular History of France from the Earliest Times, Volume 4, by François Guizot. Translated by Robert Black. Chapter 34. Henry III and the Religious Wars, 1574 to 1589, Part 7. Thus was the way paved and the beginning made between the two kings of an alliance demanded by their mutual interests, and still more strongly by the interests of France, ravaged and desolated for nearly 30 years past by religious civil wars. Henry of Navarre had profound sympathy for his country's sufferings, an ardent desire to put a stop to them, and at the same time the instinct to see clearly that the day had come when the re-establishment of harmony and common action between himself and Henry de Valois was the necessary and at the same time possible means of attaining that great result. On the 4th of March, 1589, soon after the States of Blois had been dismissed, he set before France in an eloquent manifesto the expression of his anxieties and his counsels. "I will speak freely," said he, "to myself first and then to others, that we may be all of us without excuse. Let us not be puffed up with pride on one side or another. As for me, although I have received more favors from God in this than in all past wars, and whilst the two other parties, how sad that they must be so called, are enfeebled, mine, to all appearance, has been strengthened. Nevertheless, I well know that whenever I go beyond my duty, God will no longer bless me, and I shall do so whenever, without reason and in sheer lightness of heart, I attack my king and trouble the repose of his kingdom. I declare, then, first of all to those who belong to the party of the king my lord, that if they do not counsel him to make use of me, and of the means which God hath given me for to make war, not on them of Lorraine, not on Paris, Orleans, or Toulouse, but on those who shall hinder the peace and the obedience owed to this crown, they alone will be answerable for the woes which will come upon the king and the kingdom. And as to those who still adhere to the name and party of the League, I, as a Frenchman, conjure them to put up with their losses as I do with mine, and to sacrifice their quarrels, vengeance, and ambition to the welfare of France, their mother, to the service of their king, to their own repose and ours. If they do otherwise, I hope that God will not abandon the king, and will put it into his heart to call around him his servants, myself the first, who wish for no other title, and who shall have sufficient might and good right to help him wipe out their memory from the world and their party from France. I wish these written words to go proclaiming for me throughout the world that I am ready to ask my lord the king for peace, for the repose of his kingdom, and for my own. And finally, if I find one or another so sleepy-headed or so ill-disposed that none is moved thereby, I will call God to my aid, and, true servant of my king, worthy of the honour that belongs to me as premier prince of this realm, though all the world should have conspired for its ruin, I protest before God and before man that, at the risk of 10,000 lives, I will essay, all alone, to prevent it." End quote. It is pleasing to think that this patriotic step and these powerful words were not without influence over the result which was attained. The King of Navarre set to work, at the same time with Rosny, one of the most eminent, and with Philip du Plessis-Mornay, the most sterling of his servants. And a month after the publication of his manifesto, on the 3rd of April, 1589, a truce for a year was concluded between the two kings. It set forth that the King of Navarre should serve the King of France with all his might and main, that he should have for the movements of his troops on both banks of the Loire the place of Saumur, that the places of which he had made himself master should be handed over to Henry III, and that he might not anywhere do anything to the prejudice of the Catholic religion. that the Protestants should be no more disquieted throughout the whole of France, and that before the expiration of the truce, King Henry III. Should give them assurance of peace. This negotiation was not concluded without difficulty, especially as regarded the town of Saumur. There was a general desire to cede to the King of Navarre only some place of less importance on the Loire; and when, on the 15th of April, du Plessis-Mornay, who had been appointed governor of it, presented himself for admittance at the head of his garrison, the royalist commandant, who had to deliver the keys to him, limited himself to letting them drop at his feet. Mornay showed alacrity in picking them up. On the 29th of April, the two kings had, each on his own behalf, made their treaty public. Henry III. Sent word to the King of Navarre that he wished to see him and have some conversation with him. Many of the King of Navarre's friends dissuaded him from this interview, saying, "They are traitors. Do not put yourself in their power. Remember the St. Bartholomew." This counsel was repeated to him on the 30th of April, at the very moment when he was stepping aboard the boat to cross the Loire and go to pay Henry III. A visit at the castle of Plessis-les-Tours. The King of Navarre made no account of it. "God hath bidden me to cross and see him," he answered. "It is not in the power of man to keep me back, for God is guiding me and crossing with me. Of that I am certain." And he crossed the river. "It is incredible," says L'Estoile, "what joy everybody felt at this interview. There was such a throng of people that, notwithstanding all efforts to preserve order, the two kings were a full quarter of an hour in the roadway of Plessis Park, holding out their hands to one another, without being able to join them. People climbed trees to see them. All shouted with great vigor and exultation, 'Hurrah for the king! Hurrah for the King of Navarre! Hurrah for the kings!' At last, having joined hands, they embraced very lovingly, even to tears. The King of Navarre, on retiring in the evening, said, 'I shall now die happy, since God hath given me grace to look upon the face of my king and make him an offer of my services.' I know not if those were his words, but what is certain is that everybody at this time, both kings and people, except fanatical Leaguers, regarded peace as a great public blessing, and were rejoiced to have a prospect of it before their eyes. The very day of the interview, the King of Navarre wrote to du Plessis-Mornay, 'Monsieur du Plessis, the ice is broken, not without numbers of warnings that if I went I was a dead man. I crossed the water, commending myself to God, who by his goodness not only preserved me, but caused extreme joy to appear on the king's countenance, and the people to cheer so that never was the like, even shouting, 'Hurrah for the kings!' whereat I was much vexed." Some days afterwards, during the night of May 8, the Duke of Mayenne made an attack upon Tours, and carried for the moment the Faubourg Saint-Symphorien, which gave Henry III. Such a fright that he was on the point of leaving the city and betaking himself to a distance. But the King of Navarre, warned in time, entered Tours, and at his approach the Leaguers fell back. "When the white scarfs appeared, coming to the king's rescue, the Duke of Mayenne and his troops began shouting to them, 'Back, white scarfs, back! Chatillon, we are not set against you, but against the murderers of your father,' meaning thereby that they were set against King Henry de Valois only, and not against the Huguenots. But Chatillon, amongst the rest, answered them, 'You are all of you traitors to your country. I trample underfoot all vengeance and all private interests when the service of my prince and of the state is concerned,' which he said so loudly that even his Majesty heard it, and praised him for it, and loved him for it." The two kings determined to move on Paris and besiege it, and towards the end of July their camp was pitched before the walls. Great was the excitement throughout Europe as well as France, at the courts of Madrid and Rome as well as in the park of Plessis-les-Tours. A very serious blow for Philip II, and a very bad omen for the future of his policy, was this alliance between Henry de Valois and Henry of Navarre, between a great portion of the Catholics of France and the Protestants. Philip II. Had plumed himself upon being the patron of absolute power in religious as well as political matters, and the dominant power throughout Europe in the name of Catholicism and Spain. In both these respects he ran great risk of being beaten by a king of France who was a Protestant or an ally of Protestants, and supported by the Protestant influence of England, Holland, and Germany. In Italy itself and in Catholic Europe, Philip did not find the harmony and support for which he looked. The Republic of Venice was quietly but certainly well disposed towards France, and determined to live on good terms with the King of France, a friend of Protestants, or even himself Protestant. And what hurt Philip II still more was that Pope Sixtus V himself, though all the while upholding the unity and authority of the Roman Church, was bent upon not submitting to the yoke of Spain, and upon showing a favorable disposition towards France. "France is a very noble kingdom," he said to the Venetian ambassador Gritti. "The Church has always obtained great advantages from her. We love her beyond measure, and we are pleased to find that the Signory shares our affection." Another day he expressed to him his disapprobation of the League. "We cannot praise, indeed we must blame, the first act committed by the Duke of Guise, which was to take up arms and unite with other princes against the king. Though he made religion a pretext, he had no right to take up arms against his sovereign." And again, "The union of the King of France with the heretics is no longer a matter of doubt. But, after all, Henry of Navarre is worth a great many of Henry III. This latter will have the measure he meted to the Guises." So much equity and mental breadth on the pope's part was better suited for the Republic of Venice than for the King of Spain. "We have but one desire," wrote the Doge Cicogna to Bodero, his ambassador at Rome, "and that is to keep the European peace. We cannot believe that Sixtus V, that great pontiff, is untrue to his charge, which is to ward off from the Christian world the dangers that threaten it. In imitation of him whom he represents on earth, he will show mercy, and not proceed to acts which would drive the King of France to despair." During the great struggle with which Europe was engaged in the 16th century, the independence of states, religious tolerance, and political liberty thus sometimes found, besides their regular and declared champions, protectors, useful on occasion although they were timid, even amongst the habitual allies of Charles V.'s despotic and persecuting successor. On arriving before Paris towards the end of July, 1589, the two kings besieged it with an army of 42,000 men, the strongest and the best they had ever had under their orders. "The affairs of Henry III," says de Thou, "had changed face. Fortune was pronouncing for him." Quartered in the house of Count de Retz at St. Cloud, he could thence see quite at his ease his city of Paris. "Yonder," said he, "is the heart of the League. It is there that the blow must be struck. It was great pity to lay in ruins so beautiful and goodly a city. Still, I must settle accounts with the rebels who are in it, and who ignominiously drove me away." On Tuesday, August 1, at 8 a.m., he was told, says L'Etoile, that a monk desired to speak with him, but that his guards made a difficulty about letting him in. "Let him in," said the king. "If he is refused, it will be said that I drive monks away, and will not see them." Incontinently entered the monk, having in his sleeve a knife unsheathed. He made a profound reverence to the king, who had just got up and had nothing on but a dressing gown about his shoulders, and presented to him despatches from Count de Brienne, saying that he had further orders to tell the king privately something of importance. Then the king ordered those who were present to retire, and began reading the letter which the monk had brought, asking for a private audience afterwards. The monk, seeing the king's attention taken up with reading, drew his knife from his sleeve and drove it right into the king's small gut, below the navel, so home that he left the knife in the hole. The which the king, having drawn out with great exertion, struck the monk a blow with the point of it on his left eyebrow, crying, "Ah, wicked monk, he has killed me! Kill him!" At which cry, running quickly up, the guards and others, such as happened to be nearest, massacred this assassin of a Jacobin, who, D'Aubigne says, stretched out his two arms against the wall, counterfeiting the crucifix, whilst the blows were dealt him. Having been dragged out dead from the king's chamber, he was stripped naked to the waist, covered with his gown, and exposed to the public. Whilst Henry de Valois was thus struck down at St. Cloud, Henry of Navarre had moved with a good number of troops to the Pre aux Clercs; and seeing Rosny, who was darting along, pistol in hand, amongst the foremost, he called one of his gentlemen and said, "Maignan, go and tell M. de Rosny to come back. He will get taken or wounded in that rash style." "I should not care to speak so to him," answered Maignan. I will tell him that your Majesty wants him." Meanwhile up came a gentleman at a gallop, who said 3 or 4 words in the King of Navarre's ear. "My friend," said Henry to Rosny, "the king has just been wounded with a knife in the stomach. Let us go and see about it. Come with me." Henry took with him 25 gentlemen. The king received him affectionately, exhorted him to change his religion for his salvation's sake in another world and his fortunes in this; and, addressing the people of quality who thronged his chamber, he said, "I do pray you as my friends, and as your king I order you, to recognize after my death my brother here. For my satisfaction, and as your bounden duty, I pray you to swear it to him in my presence." All present took the oath. Henry III. spoke in a firm voice, and his wound was not believed to be mortal. Letters were sent in his name to the queen, to the governors of the provinces, and to the princes allied to the crown, to inform them of the accident that had happened to the king, "which, please God, will turn out to be nothing." The King of Navarre asked for some details as to the assassin. James Clement was a young Dominican who, according to report, had been a soldier before he became a monk. He was always talking of waging war against Henry de Valois, and he was called Captain Clement. He told a story about a vision he had of an angel, who had bidden him to put to death the tyrant of France, in return for which he would have the crown of martyrdom. Royalist writers report that he had been placed in personal communication with the friends of Henry de Guise, even with his sister the Duchess of Montpensier, and his brother the Duke of Mayenne. When well informed of the facts, the King of Navarre returned to his quarters at Meudon, and Rosny to his lodging at the foot of the castle. Whilst Rosny was at supper, his secretary came and said to him, "Sir, the King of Navarre, peradventure the King of France, wants you. M. d'Orthoman writes to him to make haste and come to St. Cloud if he would see the king alive." The King of Navarre at once departed. Just as he arrived at St. Cloud, he heard in the streets cries of "Ah, my God, we are lost!" He was told that the king was dead. Henry III., in fact, expired on the 2d of August, 1589, between 2 and 3 in the morning. The first persons Henry of Navarre encountered as he entered the Hotel de Retz were the officers of the Scottish Guard, who threw themselves at his feet, saying, "Ah, sir, you are now our king and our master." End of section 52. End of A Popular History of France from the Earliest Times, Volume 4, by François Guizot.